My grandfather passed away 2 months ago on January 14th, 1992. It was cold that morning. I remember standing by the window of the home in Trier he'd lived in since I was born, watching the snow gently descend on the cobblestones below. According to the doctor, he died quietly in his sleep, 3 days after his 72nd birthday, the same way he lived much of his life, peacefully, without complaint. I was the first to arrive and the last to leave. I always had been Grandpa's favorite, or at least, that's what my cousins would joke about. Our grandmother Heidi had passed just 5 months before him. I guess in a strange way, it made sense they would leave so close together. They had always been inseparable since their marriage a year after World War II had ended. It's almost poetic. My grandfather lived a good life by all accounts. After he married Grandma Heidi, they raised 3 children, and he worked for the rest of his years at the port in Trier until his retirement. He was the kind of man who could tell stories for hours, though rarely did he ever talk about the war. My name is Otto Adler. I'm the eldest of Grandpa's 4 grandchildren. I'm 18 now, and my younger cousins, Amalia, who's 17, and the 15-year-old twins, Thomas and Astrid, had all gathered together with our parents to help sort through Grandpa's belongings. As expected, most of what we found were old tools, boxes of faded photographs, and several leather-bound diaries he had written over the years. Most were from his time working at the port of Trier, where he spent decades after the war. But tucked deep in the back of the closet, we found a box, locked almost ceremoniously with a faded iron key taped beneath it. Inside were several smaller journals, all older, their pages yellowed and stained with time. However, one of the first journals on the top had a specific symbol on the cover. It was a black German eagle that stood on a circle with a swastika in it. This must be Grandpa Albert's journal and documents from the days of the Third Reich and World War II. Amalia said. Thomas nodded and said, "Yeah, although Grandpa did tell us many stories, every time when we asked about his time during the war, he would always give a look of concern. Do you guys think something would be in here that could explain why he didn't talk about it?" "I don't know," I said. "Maybe one of these journals or documents could give us a clue on why he never talked about the 30s and the first part of the 40s. I think we should all take a look in these documents so that we might find a clue about his silence to us about the war," Astrid said eagerly. I nodded and said that I might take some of them to my school to show it to my history teacher of my last year, since she was a person who preferred to show documents of the Third Reich as evidence of what life was like for the Germans under Hitler and the Nazi regime. The first journals and documents were about his early life in Germany. He had witnessed how Hitler and the Nazis came to power in 1933. I also read the journal with the eagle and swastika on the cover, which was his enlistment in the Hitler Youth in 1934 when he was 14 years old. After reading his diaries of his day in the Hitler Youth, we read some diaries about his enlistment in the Wehrmacht, specifically within the Heer, the German land forces. At first, we read some diaries about his training days and how he was stationed as a soldier on the western coast of occupied Denmark. Then we read diaries about when Germany launched Operation Barbarossa and invaded the Soviet Union. We read diaries about his days on the Eastern Front against the Soviets, like fighting in places like Pskov, Novgorod, and Volkhov. In many of his diaries, he spoke of the things he witnessed, like movements of infantry, skirmishes, the Russian bitter cold, dysentery, frostbite, and death. Later we read his newer diaries that were made between the summer of 1942 and early May 1945. Here we saw his experiences on the Western Front. Our grandfather wrote on how they had been pushed back out of France, how he witnessed the Battle of the Bulge in Belgium and witnessed the capitulation of the Third Reich. Yet, none of these diaries seem to have been filled with emotions. Grandfather had always been stoic, but this was beyond anything I knew. It was as if he were recording someone else's memories. "This is pointless," Amalia said. "None of these stories seem to have any clue on why Grandpa Albert doesn't want to share his stories of the war." "I agree," Astrid said. "We've been digging for like 2.5 hours, and we still couldn't find anything." I sighed and said, "Alright then, let's put these journals back in the box, but keep them so we can show them to our history teachers in the future." Everyone nodded, but as I placed the first journal back in the box, I noticed something about the side of the bottom of the box. I stuck my hand in and pulled on the side of it. It was a false bottom. Underneath that false bottom, I saw another old journal with a brown leather cover. "Guys, look," I said to my cousins. The three came to my side and gasped. "Another journal?" Amalia asked. "There was a false bottom covering it," I said to my cousin. "Maybe this could give us some info about Grandpa's silence of his time during the war," Astrid said. As I took the journal out of the box, I noticed that it was the back of the journal. I turned the journal around and saw that the journal even had a name. I'm not sure whether or not I should have taken the journal out, but the title of the journal sure gave us the chills when we saw it, even though it were only 3 words. Das russische Horrordorf, the Russian horror village. We looked at each other, me, Amalia, the twins, and without speaking, we took it to the dining table and sat down. It began on March 20th, 1942. The date was scrawled across the top, underlined twice. And for the first time, the tone of my grandfather's writing changed. Gone was the detached soldier. Gone was the clerk recording logistics. What remained was a terrified man recounting something he had tried very hard to forget. This is his story. March 20th, 1942. Near Leningrad, Eastern Front. The snow hadn't stopped in days. It wasn't the kind of snow that blanketed the earth in beauty. It was a relentless, choking kind of cold. The sort that made your lungs sting with every breath and turned your boots into stiff leather prisons. It made the trees in the taiga look like hunched, dying giants. The wind keened through the black pines like a chorus of spirits too exhausted to scream. I hadn't seen much of the sun since we left the main road 3 days ago. We were 20 men, 19 now if you counted poor Walter, who stepped on a landmine 2 nights back while relieving himself behind a tree. His screams had been short-lived, but none of us forgot them. No one talked about it afterward. We just buried what was left of him under the roots of a dead birch and kept moving. Our objective was vague, as it always was in those days. Investigate reports of partisans operating out of abandoned villages north of the front lines. Simple, sweep and report, eliminate any threats. They always said it was like a routine patrol, but there was nothing routine about this place. But I am accompanied by 2 soldiers who are my closest comrades and are the reason I didn't fall into a complete depression. Jürgen and Karl. Jürgen was the kind of guy who would mostly joke about certain things, while Karl would be the guy who would help those in need. But God, I just can't stand the smell of all the cigarettes Karl smokes. I keep saying it's bad for his health, but he already smoked secretly during his time in the Hitler Youth. Our commanding officer, Oberleutnant Vogt, led us with the typical arrogance of a man who had never fought outside a command tent. The SS squad, however, marched beside us in perfect silence, all 8 of them, clean uniforms, smug faces, and the unmistakable air of superiority. I hated every one of them, especially Hans. Hans stood half a head taller than the rest of his squad, but he carried himself like some sort of Teutonic knight resurrected from the battle on the ice in 1242. He talked down to everyone, our men, our sergeant, even Vogt, and no one dared correct him because he wore the silver runes on his collar, and his men followed him like obedient dogs. I don't trust those bastards, Jürgen muttered under his breath as we huddled under a canopy of snow-heavy branches for a rest. Neither do I said. They act like they're on a pilgrimage. Karl, sitting across from us with a cigarette between trembling fingers, grunted. A pilgrimage into what? There's nothing out here but snow and trees. No Russians, no partisans, not even animals. That much was true. The forest was too quiet, even at night. There were no howls, no bird song, just wind and the occasional creak of frozen wood. Nature itself seemed to hold its breath. Then came the smell. We picked it up on the afternoon of the 4th day. It wasn't rot. It was something chemical, like sulfur and old blood. At first we thought it might be an abandoned supply depot, or maybe corpses frozen in a cellar, but it grew stronger the farther we marched. And eventually, we saw the smoke. Thin wisps of grey barely visible against the overcast sky. They rose from behind a ridge thick with pine, coiling like grasping fingers. Vogt raised a hand, signaling us to stop. He turned, looking down at the SS squad. Hans tilted his head, his sharp features unmoved. "We'll take point." "No," Sergeant Weber interjected. "My men will go first." Tension crackled like gunpowder in dry air. The SS men shifted, their hands close to their weapons. Jürgen stood beside me, lips drawn into a hard line. I felt the chill seep deeper, not from the snow, but from the sudden possibility of a fight breaking out amongst ourselves. Vogt stepped between them. "We go in together," he said, "side by side, no arguments." With that, we began our descent toward the smoke. The village was unlike anything I'd seen before. It was nestled between steep forested hills, shrouded in mist that hadn't been there moments before. The buildings were intact, but twisted somehow, like they had sagged or melted slightly. Roofs curved in unnatural ways, and windows gaped open like empty eye sockets. A crude wooden sign stood at the village's entrance, partially buried in snow. The letters on the sign were in Russian Cyrillic, but luckily a soldier from our squad was able to speak and read Russian. Zimorotkino. The name sounded foreign even to our ears, unnatural in its syllables. There were no footprints, no voices, just the wind pushing the smoke through the trees like a warning. "This place is wrong," Karl whispered, and he was right, but we entered it anyway. March 24th, 1942. We stepped into the village like trespassers in a forgotten tomb. The snow was deeper here, as though untouched for decades. No footprints, no cart tracks, no signs of movements, just a thick, suffocating silence that pressed down on us like the sky itself was holding its breath. "Not a soul," Jürgen whispered. His voice sounded too loud. "Keep your weapons ready," Sergeant Weber said, sweeping his MP40 from house to house. "This could be a partisan trap." But even the SS were uneasy. Hans scanned the rooftops, eyes narrowed, and muttered something under his breath. Latin, I think. A prayer, maybe? Strange coming from a man who often mocked religion other than Nordic or Germanic paganism as a crutch for the weak. The buildings themselves were old, more ancient than anything I'd seen in Russia. Most were wooden, blackened by time and frost, their doors hanging loose on rusted hinges. The windows had no glass, only open holes like staring mouths. Some homes had collapsed in on themselves, sagging into strange, unnatural shapes. Karl nudged me. "That one, it looks like it melted." He wasn't wrong. One of the cottages had warped timber beams that drooped like candle wax. The roof had caved inward in a spiral, as if drawn down by some vortex. There were no signs of fire or shelling, no bullet holes, just wrongness. We split into 3 groups. My unit, with Jürgen, Karl, and 3 others, was assigned to the northern edge of the village, near a crumbling chapel. The SS took the eastern side. Vogt and the others held the center near what looked like a town square, if you could call a circle of stones a square. The moment we stepped past the threshold of the chapel's shadow, the air changed. It was colder here, dead cold. My breath didn't even fog the air anymore. Inside the chapel, however, it was worse. The floorboards creaked like bones. The pews were shattered, splintered as if someone or something had thrashed through them. Faded icons of saints and angels clung to the walls, their faces warped or gouged out entirely. A massive Orthodox crucifix lay broken at the altar, the carved Christ disfigured, his arms stretched down instead of out. It was pointing to the floor, more specifically, to the trap door. It was set into the stone beneath the altar, made of ironwood and bound with old copper nails. Someone had painted crude symbols on it, circles within circles, jagged lines. It didn't look Russian. It didn't look human. Jürgen stared at it, unmoving. "I don't like this," he said. Karl raised his rifle. "Do we open it?" I started to answer when we heard the scream. It tore across the village like a knife through silk. Not a gunshot, not a wounded man. It was something else, something high-pitched and inhuman. We ran toward the sound, toward the SS squad. When we eventually reached where the sound came from, we saw that the courtyard was nothing but chaos. Blood stained the snow, One of the SS men, Keller I think, was thrashing on the ground, eyes rolled back, mouth foaming. Another was already dead, slumped against the wall with half his face torn open. A third had vanished entirely, just a rifle, still warm, lying in the snow. Hans stood over Keller, shouting, shaking him, trying to hold him down. When we reached him, the man was still convulsing, whispering something in Russian over and over again, though he didn't speak a word of it. We tried to grab him. Karl got his arms, and I got his legs. But then, Keller's body stiffened like a board, and his back arched so violently we heard something snap. Then there was silence. He died with his mouth wide open and his eyes staring straight at the sky. Hans staggered back. "He saw something. I told you this place was cursed." Vogt was shouting now, trying to re-establish order, but his voice barely carried. A wind had picked up, sharp and high like a scream. The snow blew sideways, stinging our faces. The sky darkened, though it was only mid-afternoon. "We're pulling back to the western edge," Vogt ordered. "Barricade the largest house and dig in. No more patrols. We wait for the morning." March 25th, 1942. The wind hadn't stopped screaming since midnight. We tried to sleep in shifts, but it was impossible. Even the SS, normally so stiff with pride, were rattled. One of them, young Miller, had refused to speak since we barricaded ourselves inside the mayor's house. He just sat in the corner, clutching his helmet to his chest, rocking slowly back and forth like a child during a thunderstorm. The snow outside no longer looked like snow. It was gray now, ash gray, and it fell in slow circling patterns, as if drawn by invisible hands. At 4:10, Vogt called us together. "We're going back to the chapel," he said. "There's something underneath it. That's where the source is." I didn't ask how he knew. No one did. Maybe he didn't know. Maybe something told him. But it felt right. Hans was already outside when we left, staring at the sky. "There's no dawn coming," he said flatly. "The sun doesn't rise here." There were 14 of us left. We entered the chapel like men walking into their own graves. The air was thick and heavy, like breathing through wet wool. The broken crucifix was still where we left it, arms pointing down at the trapdoor. It was sealed shut, but not locked, just held by something we couldn't see. We pried at it with bayonets, rifle butts, even a crowbar Karl found in the stable. The trapdoor groaned as it opened, louder than it should have, like a scream muffled under centuries of soil. We stood in a ring, silent, the frost of our breath hanging like smoke in the cold chapel air. No one moved at first. Even Hans hesitated at the edge of the darkness, torchlight flickering on his pale, tight face. The staircase beneath was steep, made of stone polished smooth from age, slick with a glaze of ice and something darker. Damp, almost oily. The air that wafted from the opening was warm, but not comforting. It was wet, like exhalation from some ancient animal. And underneath it was a smell that set something off deep inside me. Sulfur, mold, old iron, and something like burned hair. It didn't belong in any church. It didn't belong anywhere. "I'll go first," Hans said, snapping his MP40 into his gloved hand. He dropped down into the hole without another word. One by one, we followed. The first thing we noticed was how quickly the light vanished. After only a few steps, the glow from the chapel above was gone, swallowed by the stone. We had a few torches between us, German issue, thick-beamed and reliable, but their reach seemed stunted here, as though the dark fought back against the light. I was the fifth man down, behind Karl and ahead of Jürgen. I remember my boots slipping on the third step, not from ice, no. This was different. Greasy, something coated the walls and floor, and though I didn't dare reach out and touch it, the slickness beneath our boots clung to everything. The walls were marked with scratches, some deep, long gouges, others shallow and frantic. No words, just desperate clawing, as if someone or something had tried to climb out. "Do you hear that?" Jürgen whispered behind me. At first, it was nothing. Then, like stone teeth tapping together in rhythm, It was coming from far below, beneath the staircase, maybe from the bottom, or maybe deeper. Could be water, Karl muttered ahead of me, but we all knew it wasn't. The air grew heavier with every turn. The staircase coiled in on itself, a spiral tighter than seemed possible, like we were walking into a noose of granite. The curve of the walls pressed inward, subtly at first, then more aggressively. It wasn't long before we had to crouch, then stoop, then half crawl. This isn't right. Weezer sat behind me, voice tight. This wasn't made for men. But we still went down, because we couldn't go back. The light behind us was gone. I don't remember when it disappeared, only that we looked behind at some point, and there was nothing. Just more blackness. Endless black. My chest tightened, not just from fear. Something else. The pressure down here was unnatural. My ears ached. My nose started bleeding. So did Karl's. We stopped. What in God's name is this place? Someone muttered. Hans looked up at us, his torch casting long shadows on the twisting walls. He didn't answer. He just kept going, muttering that same string of Latin under his breath. Something about custodes dormient, sleeping guardians. Where had he learned that? Then, without warning, the stairway ended. Just ended. It dropped us into a white landing, maybe 4 meters across. The walls were lined with carvings, not just scratched, but carved with deep inhuman precision. Circles, spirals, branching lines like veins or roots. No writing, no symbols we could identify, just raw geometry that hurt the eye. Ahead of us stood a door, round, made of solid black stone, taller than 2 men, covered in a crust of pale white growth that looked like calcified lichen or bone. It had no handle, no hinges, just a faint seam down the middle. We stood there for a long time, saying nothing. The door didn't open. It breathed. I swear to God, I saw it expand, just slightly, like the chest of something asleep. Should we go back? Someone asked, one of the SS men I think. His voice trembled. But there was no back. We knew it. We felt it. The stairway was gone. Not physically, but in our minds. Our memories of it already felt distant, warped. The descent had changed us, or the space, or both. Hans stepped forward. He raised his hand, and the stone door opened on its own. The door opened soundlessly, not like stone grinding against stone, but like a wound being peeled open. A sudden exhale of warm, damp air washed over us as thick as breath, sweet with rot. For a moment, none of us moved. Our torches flickered violently, dimming to sickly halos. Then Hans stepped through. The rest of us followed, because what else could we do? The chamber we stepped in was wrong. Vast beyond logic, larger than anything that could have fit beneath the village. I turned in place, my torch shaking in my hand, and saw that the staircase had vanished behind us. Where there should have been a door, a wall, or even a tunnel, we now saw only a void. Not black stone, not shadow, just absence. And above us, nothing. The ceiling was too high to see. The light didn't touch it. The walls curved outward, distant and uneven, pulsating gently like the inside of a living organ. No architecture could explain this place. No sane architect would have imagined it. Everything echoed wrong. Footsteps rang seconds too late. Whispers bounced back in voices not our own. Even our breathing was distorted, shallow in our chests but loud in our ears. And at the center of the chamber stood an altar. It was raised on a platform of spiraled stone, carved with concentric grooves that seemed to shift when you look at them too long. Blood, old, brown, and almost waxy, pooled in the grooves, never drying. The altar itself was formed from a single slab of black rock, its surface etched with more of the same maddening spiral patterns. On its surface were remains, bones twisted and reshaped. Not arranged bones, but ones grown into the altar as if the flesh had fused with the stone and then dissolved, leaving only warped skeletons. And around the altar lay hundreds of smaller bones, child-sized, not arranged in any ritual pattern, just scattered, like they had crawled to it or maybe fled from it. Then we all saw the symbols on the walls. "Those aren't Russian," Karl said as he pointed to the walls. He was right. The symbols weren't Cyrillic, Latin, or even ancient Slavic runes. They weren't from any human system of writing. They were organic, bone-white, grown into the wall like fungus, each one pulsing faintly when the torchlight passed over it. One looked like a spiral folding into itself, another like a spider devouring its own legs, but most of them were indescribable. These were shapes that made you dizzy when you stared too long, forms that seemed to shift subtly, as if aware of being watched. "Stop looking," Jurgen muttered. "It gets inside you." That's when I first heard the whispers. Soft, high-pitched, like a child humming underwater. They came from nowhere, from everywhere, not spoken aloud, but pressed into the back of my skull like fingers made of ice. They didn't speak in words, they spoke in impulses, half-suggestions that bypassed language. "Feed it. Stay here. Bury yourself in the floor." One of the SS soldiers dropped his rifle. He walked forward, slowly, eyes glazed, until Hans tackled him to the ground. He was smiling. Hans whispered anxiously, "Did you see? He was smiling." We split into small clusters to explore the chamber. I stayed with Jurgen and Karl. Weber, Hans, and the others spread out, calling back to one another through the dark. But the acoustics were broken. Someone would speak to the left, but their voice would echo from behind us, or from above. Even worse, some voices echoed that didn't belong to any of us. I remember Karl stopping in his tracks and whispering, "Mother?" His torch flickered as he turned slowly to the left. "She's here," he said. "Who?" I asked. He didn't answer. We found a series of shallow pits on the far side of the chamber. Each was filled with rows of skeletal remains arranged like roots. Hundreds of them fused into each other, stretching downward like vines. It was impossible to tell where one skeleton ended and the next began. Weber called them gardens, half joking, but I knew what he meant. They weren't buried. They had grown that way, entangled, replanted, made into something new. It was around this point that most of us began bleeding from the nose, some from the ears. I looked down at my boots and saw the skin of my fingers sloughing slightly, like I was beginning to dissolve, microscopically in fact. Hans said something about the blood waking it up. No one asked what it was, but we already knew. At the farthest end of the chamber, we found a second door. Not a real one, more like a wound in the stone pulsating faintly. Something behind it was moving. We heard wet, slithering sounds. We felt vibrations in the soles of our boots. Hans walked closer. "It's waiting," he said. "It knows." Jurgen grabbed my arm. "We have to leave. Now." I nodded, but the truth hung heavy in the stale air. There was no way back. The spiral only goes one way. Then, the vibration stopped. For a moment, it was completely silent. No footsteps, no whispers, no breath. Even the torch flames froze, suspended in a vacuum that made the air feel thick, as though we were underwater. Then the door, if you can even call it that, began to open. It didn't move like stone. It peeled layer by layer, like diseased skin sliding off old meat. Each fold opened, not with sound, but with a feeling, like pressure building behind your eyes, like static inside your skull. The stone around it quivered. At first, there was nothing behind it, but then came the eye. Not a literal eye. There were no pupils or irises, no sclera, no lashes, but we felt it seeing us, a pinpoint of infinite focus, a weight falling across the chamber. Every torch ran out, not instantly, but one by one. A domino effect of darkness, as if the chamber itself were snuffing them out. Screams erupted. The floor vibrated with approaching movement, slithering, wet, muscular. It wasn't fast. It didn't even have to be. Hans was the first one to fire. with some shots from his MP40 cracking through the air. Then, for a moment, there was silence, but then came a sound that I will never forget. Crunching, like snapping twigs in marrow. Then Hans began to scream. The chamber further dissolved into madness. In the dark, men turned their weapons on nothing, or worse, on each other. I heard Weber shout out orders, but they came garbled, reversed, looped back on themselves like a tape spool unwinding. The geometry of the room twisted. We couldn't run straight, only in circles. The floor bulged in places and sucked downward in others, like it was breathing beneath our boots. I ran into Karl. He grabbed my shoulder. "It's inside us," he whispered. "It sees through our eyes." His skin was pale, too pale. His pupils were spirals. Then he let go and sprinted into the dark. A second later, nothing, not even a scream. He was just gone. Something thumped to my right, wet and heavy, like meat dropped onto tile. A figure appeared in the dark, not walking but slithering. It wasn't shaped right. It had a torso, elongated and ribless, and arms that bent the wrong way. No legs, no face. Its surface shimmered as though covered in oil, and from its back extended tendrils that were as thick as tree roots, each tipped with bony clicking claws. It reached out. I opened fire, screaming, not expecting it to do anything. But it screamed back, not from its mouth, since it had none, but from within me. The scream came up through my own throat, hijacking my breath, forcing itself out in a pitch I didn't know a human could make. I collapsed. It passed me by. I still don't know why. I crawled across the stone, nails breaking, teeth chattering. The chamber echoed with voices now, not screams, but chanting. They weren't ours, they were theirs. Dozens, hundreds, a choir of the devoured, singing in tones too perfect, too mechanical. Each voice we'd lost, Karl, Müller, Weber, even Hans, blended into a single droning litany. Their souls had not been eaten, they had been recruited. I found Jürgen kneeling in front of the altar, his head bowed, hands clasped. I touched his shoulder. He turned to me slowly and smiled. "I understand now," he said. "It's not a god. It's not a demon. It's what came before those things." Then he took his bayonet and dug into his chest, not to kill himself, but to open himself up. His blood hit the altar like gasoline. The thing reacted, and the ground split. The floor opened beneath me. Not a fall, but an extraction. Hands, human, inhuman, too many fingers, pulled me downward, with me screaming as hard as I could. I don't remember what happened next, except that I woke up in the snow frostbitten, soaked in my own piss and blood, 3 kilometers from Zimmerotkino, with no footprints behind me. I only heard the wind. I did, however, manage to gather my strength and walk back to where Zimmerotkino lay. But when I returned, there was nothing there, just an open field within a large taiga forest, as if the trees had all been removed by human activity. When I saw that the village had completely disappeared, I couldn't think but wonder if me and my comrades had stumbled upon something that is supernatural or not. The last thing I remember was falling again onto the snow and passing out. Only when I did close my eyes, I could see the images of people on the open field, before everything went dark. A day later, I woke up in the snow, and after about 2 hours of slowly walking to the southwest, I stumbled across a German patrol. I was delirious, frostbitten, babbling about roots and eyes and doors that breathe. The German officers of the patrol group thought I had shell shock or something similar to that. They sent me to a field hospital near Pskov. They later asked me what truly happened. I wanted to tell them the truth, but I knew none of them would believe me and label me as insane. I simply told them we were attacked by a large patrol of Soviet soldiers and that I was the only one to somehow survive. They didn't ask any further things, and I decided to never speak of this to anyone. But to make sure I would never forget what had happened in that God knows what village in the Russian wilderness, I am writing this down in this separate diary. There are things in this world that cannot be explained. But what I saw that day or night, or whatever it was, in the village of Zimuratkino, I think it might be something that neither God or even Satan himself had created. I personally hope that no one else would ever stumble upon that place again. Or worse, if there are other places similar like that one in all of Russia, or even the world. For I can tell you this, some things do not stay buried. Not in the snow. Not in time. Back to March 14th, 1992. None of us spoke for a long time. The only sound was the grandfather clock in the hallway, ticking like a slow heartbeat. It was especially the final line in the diary that gave the 14s a cold chill across their spine. I looked up slowly, my throat dry. The fireplace in the corner flickered like it didn't belong here anymore, like it had followed us down into the dark rather than offered us light. Amalia sat opposite me, arms wrapped tightly around herself, staring at the floor. Her face was pale, paler than I'd ever seen it, and she was biting the inside of her cheek hard enough to make it bleed. Thomas hadn't said a word since the part where our grandfather described the thing that took Jürgen. He looked like he was going to be sick. Astrid, usually the most composed of us, was trembling. Astrid's voice finally broke the silence, barely a whisper. He lived with that in his head for almost 50 years. No one answered her words. Somehow, the house felt different now. Our grandfather's once cozy home, the place of childhood visits, warm meals and laughter, now sat in silence, holding its breath. The walls seemed to close, the shadows deeper. Every creak of the floorboards made us flinch. Amalia was the first to stand. She walked to the window and pulled the curtain back slightly. "There's snow outside," she said. Thomas flinched. "Of course there is," I said, trying to calm my own nerves. "It's March." But I stood up anyway. I don't know why. I walked to the window next to her and looked out. It wasn't just snow. It was falling in spirals, tiny perfect spirals, like someone or something had stirred the sky with a giant hand. "I think Grandpa wanted us to read it," I said after a while. "Not just to know what he went through, but to remember." "Remember what?" Astrid asked, her voice cracked. "That monsters exist?" "No," I whispered. "That sometimes they're still waiting." We all went quiet again. Then I turned back to the diary. I flipped through the pages, not to reread the horror, but to check something. Something small. Near the front, in his careful handwriting, Albert had written the coordinates of Zimuratkino. They were still there. Not crossed out, not hidden, as if an invitation. There was something else, tucked in the back, behind the rear cover, folded once. A note. On a separate piece of paper, shaky but more recent, like written closer to the end of Grandfather's life. It simply read, "If you ever find the village again, do not go into the chapel. If the door is closed, pray. If the door is open, run." We burned the diary that night. All of it had to be burned. No ceremony, no ritual, just matches and gasoline in a metal bucket behind the shed. We watched it turn to ash in silence. But even as the paper blackened and the pages curled inward like dying leaves, I swear the smoke spiraled into the sky the same way the snow had fallen. We left the house the next morning. We didn't talk about what we'd read. Not to our parents, not to each other, not ever. But something had changed in all of us. Amalia started wearing a crucifix again. Thomas refused to go camping, even in the backyard. Astrid has recurring dreams of a spiral staircase that can't stop descending. And me? I can't walk past the church without checking the floor behind the altar. There are places in this world where time doesn't move right. Where things older than history still await beneath the earth. My grandfather didn't die of a stroke. He died of relief. Because whatever it was he saw down there, whatever followed him home, he outlived it. And now, I'm not sure we will.